German Shepherd kept barking at this boy. When parents found out why, their hearts broke. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long golden rays over the park where children laughed. Parents chatted, and the world felt light and full of life. But for Nick, the world had shrunk to the size of the wheelchair he sat in, the rubber wheels unmoving as he watched from a distance. The playground was a blur of movement, kids swinging high into the air, chasing each other across the field, kicking soccer balls with ease. He had once been part of that chaos, running, jumping, tumbling in the grass. But now he was stuck. Stuck watching, stuck remembering, stuck wishing. His hands clenched the armrests of his chair as he swallowed the lump in his throat, trying to ignore the way his chest tightened whenever he saw a child his age dart past. Carefree and unaware of how much Nick longed to be them again, Sarah and James, his parents, sat on a nearby bench, their faces lined with quiet sorrow. They tried not to hover, not to make their concern too obvious, but Nick could feel it, as heavy as the wheelchair beneath him. They had taken him to the park hoping it would lift his spirits, but it only reminded him of what he had lost. A year had passed since the accident, a blur of hospital rooms, whispered conversations, and well-meaning doctors who spoke in soft voices, telling him things he didn't want to hear. The damage is severe. We'll try therapy. There's hope, but it will take time. He hated that word. It felt like an eternity had passed, yet nothing had changed. Then, just as he was about to ask his parents if they could leave, a sharp bark cut through the air. He turned his head, startled, to see a golden retriever bounding toward him, her tail wagging furiously, ears perked with excitement. The dog skidded to a stop right in front of him, staring at him with warm brown eyes filled with an intensity that made Nick uneasy. He tensed, unsure of what to do. He wasn't afraid of dogs, but this one felt different. It wasn't just excitement in her eyes, it was something deeper, something almost knowing. Sarah and James both rose from the bench, alarm flickering across their faces. "Whose dog is that?" James asked, scanning the park for an owner. But no one seemed to be looking for a lost pet. The retriever barked again, stepping closer to Nick, sniffing at his legs before pressing her nose against his hands where they gripped the chair. Nick pulled back instinctively, but something about her presence made him hesitate. The dog sat, tail thumping against the grass, waiting. "She's friendly," Nick murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure why he said it, but somehow he knew it was true. The dog didn't want to harm him. If anything, it felt like she had been looking for him. Sarah crouched beside the retriever, gently reaching out to check for a collar. "No tag," she muttered, frowning. "She doesn't look like a stray. She's well fed, clean." The dog didn't flinch at her touch but kept her gaze locked onto Nick, tilting her head as if waiting for something. Nick hesitated before slowly reaching out. The moment his fingers brushed against the retriever's fur, a strange warmth spread through him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was something deeper, like a memory trying to surface. The dog let out a soft whine, pushing her head against his hand, urging him to pet her. James exchanged a glance with Sarah, concern still evident in his eyes. "Maybe we should ask around, see if anyone lost a dog." Before they could move, the retriever suddenly spun around and barked, her body tensing as she took a step toward the line of trees at the far edge of the park. Then she turned back to Nick, eyes pleading. She wanted him to follow. Nick frowned. "What is it, girl?" The retriever barked again, took a few steps, then looked back. It was as if she was saying, "Come." Sarah looked uncertain. "Nick, maybe we shouldn't." "I want to see," Nick interrupted, gripping the wheels of his chair. It had been a long time since he had felt the urge to do anything, to go anywhere. But something about this dog made him want to move. James and Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding, walking beside him as he pushed his chair forward, following the retriever. The dog led them through the park, weaving between trees, past the playground, down a small dirt path that led to a secluded clearing. There, nestled beneath the roots of an old oak tree, something was half buried in the earth. The retriever barked once, then began digging furiously, sending dirt flying in all directions. "What the—" James muttered, stepping closer. Nick felt his heartbeat quicken. There was something about this moment, about this place, that felt important. The retriever paused, nose deep in the ground, then stepped back, panting heavily as if to say, "Now it's your turn." James knelt, brushing aside the loose dirt until something solid came into view. A wooden box, old and weathered, covered in ornate carvings that had been worn down with time. Sarah gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "What is this doing here?" Nick stared at the box, his fingers itching to open it. He didn't know why, but he felt like whatever was inside belonged to him. James carefully lifted it from the earth, brushing off the remaining dirt before setting it on Nick's lap. The wood was rough beneath his fingers, the carvings intricate despite their age. There was something oddly familiar about them, though he couldn't place why. "Should we open it?" Sarah asked hesitantly. Nick didn't hesitate. Yes. His fingers found the latch, but it was rusted shut. James pulled out a pocket knife, carefully wedging it beneath the clasp until it gave way with a soft click. The lid creaked as Nick pushed it open, revealing its contents, a delicate golden pendant, glinting in the sunlight, and a faded photograph. Nick's breath caught in his throat. The woman in the photo had Sarah's face, but the eyes were different, so different. A chill ran down his spine as he turned the picture over. There, in faded ink, were the words that would change everything. "To my dearest son, may you always find your way back home. Love, Lillian." Sarah's breath hitched as she read the words over Nick's shoulder, her hands trembling slightly as she reached out and gently took the photograph. The woman in the picture was eerily familiar, her face nearly identical to Sarah's, except for the eyes. They were a shade lighter, softer in expression, almost haunting. Nick felt his heart pound in his chest as he traced the faded ink with his fingertip. Lillian. The name meant nothing to him, yet it sent a strange shiver through his spine, like a whisper from a past he had never known. He looked up at his mother, searching her face for an explanation, but she only stared at the picture, eyes wide, lips parted in shock. James, who had been silently observing, finally spoke, his voice careful. "Sarah, do you know her?" Sarah swallowed, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. I don't think so." But she looked. Her voice trailed off as she studied the woman's face, her own reflection staring back at her in an uncanny way that made her stomach twist. "She looks like me." James frowned, leaning over to examine the photo more closely. Could she be a relative? A cousin, maybe, but even as he said it, there was doubt in his voice. The resemblance was too strong, too precise. Nick shifted in his wheelchair, his hands still clutching the wooden box, the golden pendant inside catching the sunlight and glinting against the aged wood. He picked it up carefully, running his fingers over the delicate engravings. The shape was simple and oval with intricate swirls that wrapped around a small indentation in the center, as if something had once fit inside. It felt warm in his palm, almost comforting, but at the same time, it carried a weight he couldn't explain. "Maybe there's something else in the box," Nick murmured, hoping for another clue. He reached inside, but aside from the pendant and the photograph, it was empty. The retriever, Maggie, who had been watching silently, let out a soft whine, her tail thumping gently against the ground as if urging them to keep going, to dig deeper. Sarah exhaled, still staring at the picture, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, as if a thought had just struck her, she turned to James. "The pendant," she whispered. "I've seen this before." James raised a brow. "Where?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she carefully took the pendant from Nick's hands, examining it closely. The engravings, the shape, the small empty indentation, it all tugged at something buried deep in her memory. Without another word, she turned on her heel and started walking briskly back toward the car. James and Nick exchanged a glance before James quickly grabbed the wheelchair's handles and followed. Maggie trotted alongside them, her eyes keen, as if she knew exactly where they were headed. The ride home was silent except for the occasional hum of the car's engine. Nick kept the photograph in his lap, unable to stop staring at it. Lillian. Who was she? Why had Maggie led them to that box? And why did it feel like a piece of his life had been uncovered? A piece he had never known was missing? When they arrived home, Sarah barely paused before rushing into their bedroom, heading straight for her jewelry box. She flung it open, digging past rings and bracelets until her hands found what she was looking for. Slowly, she pulled out a delicate golden pendant identical to the one in Nick's lap. James and Nick stood frozen in the doorway as Sarah turned toward them, holding both pendants side by side. The only difference was that hers had a small, round locket embedded in the indentation, perfectly fitted as if it had always belonged there. She pressed the locket open with trembling fingers, revealing a faded picture inside. It was of two baby girls, wrapped in identical blankets, sleeping peacefully. Nick's stomach twisted. "Mom, is that you?" Sarah's throat tightened as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I think I had a twin." James took a step forward, his brow furrowed. "But you never mentioned." "Because I never knew," Sarah interrupted, shaking her head. "I was adopted as a baby. My parents never told me anything about my birth family." The room fell into silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. Nick's fingers tightened around the photograph of Lillian, staring into the woman's familiar yet unfamiliar eyes. "If she was your twin," he said slowly then, "does that mean she's my real mother?" The words sent a ripple of shock through the room. James inhaled sharply, his gaze flicking between his wife and son, his mind racing to piece everything together. Sarah looked pale, her grip on the pendants tightening. "I don't know," she admitted, "but it makes sense, doesn't it? The photograph, the letter, the pendant. Maybe her voice broke, and she swallowed hard before continuing. "Maybe she couldn't keep you. Maybe she left you with us because..." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Nick's chest ached. He had always known he was adopted. His parents had told him from a young age. But this was different. This wasn't just about being chosen by a family who loved him. This was about discovering an entire history he had never known existed. And suddenly, he needed to know more. "We have to find out," he said firmly. "We have to know the truth." James looked hesitant, unsure of where this path would lead. But Sarah nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. "I agree. If Lillian left this for you, for us, then she wanted us to find it. She wanted us to know." Maggie barked, wagging her tail as if in approval. And for the first time in a long while, Nick felt like he wasn't stuck anymore. He was moving forward, toward something unknown, toward something that felt like destiny. The next morning, Nick awoke with the photograph still clutched in his hand, the golden pendant resting on his bedside table. The weight of yesterday's discovery sat heavily in his chest, but beneath the confusion and shock, there was a feeling he couldn't quite name, something almost electric, like the pull of an invisible thread connecting him to something he had lost without ever knowing it. He sat up slowly, his legs useless beneath the blankets, and ran his fingers over the image of Lillian, his mother, his real mother. The words felt strange in his mind, like trying on a new pair of shoes that didn't quite fit yet. He had always known Sarah and James weren't his biological parents, but he had never thought to question the rest, never thought that there might be more to his story. The sound of soft footsteps made him glance toward the doorway, where Maggie sat, her tail thumping once against the wooden floor. Her golden fur glowed in the morning light, and for a moment, Nick wondered if she had been waiting for him to wake up. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered, not expecting an answer. Maggie's ears perked up, and she padded over to his bedside, resting her chin on the mattress. There was something about the way she looked at him, something almost knowing. He reached out, stroking her fur, feeling the warmth beneath his fingertips. "What now?" he murmured. The question wasn't just for the dog. He had no idea where to go from here. He wanted answers. But where did you even begin when the person you needed them from might not even be alive? He was still lost in thought when Sarah and James entered the room, their expressions hesitant. Sarah held a steaming mug of tea, her fingers curled tightly around it, while James stood with his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Morning, Bud," James said gently. "How are you feeling?" Nick shrugged. He didn't know how to answer that. Instead, he lifted the photograph. "What do we do now?" Sarah hesitated, exchanging a glance with James before sitting on the edge of the bed. "I spent most of last night looking into old records," she admitted, "trying to find anything about Lillian." Nick's breath caught. "Did you?" Sarah sighed. "Not much, but I did find a birth record, twins born at St. Mary's Hospital, the same year as me. One of them listed as Sarah Bennett, the other Lillian Bennett." She swallowed hard, the name feeling foreign yet familiar on her tongue. That's me. That's her. But after that, there's nothing. No death records, no adoption papers for her. It's like she just disappeared. Nick frowned, gripping the edges of the photograph. But she didn't. She was alive long enough to leave this. He gestured to the wooden box on his nightstand. She had to have been out there somewhere. James ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. If she left this for you, she wanted you to find her, or at least find the truth. His voice was careful, but Nick could hear the hesitation underneath it, the unspoken worry about what they might uncover. But Nick didn't care. He needed to know. He couldn't explain why, but it felt like a piece of himself had been missing his entire life. And now that he had found the edge of it, he had to keep pulling until the whole picture was revealed. Then we find her, he said firmly. Or we find out what happened to her. Sarah nodded, determination settling in her expression. I think I know where to start. They spent the rest of the morning gathering what little information they had, old hospital records, the pendant, the letters from the wooden box. Sarah made phone calls, reaching out to places that might still have archives from decades ago, while James scoured the internet for any trace of Lillian Bennett. Nick stayed by Maggie's side, feeling restless but determined. Hours passed with little success, frustration mounting in the room like a growing storm cloud. It wasn't until late afternoon that Sarah finally hung up the phone with a strange look on her face. There's a place, she said slowly, an old estate just outside of town. It used to be a children's home back in the 80s. James frowned. What does that have to do with Lillian? Sarah bit her lip. One of the records I found lists a Lillian Bennett as a resident there. It closed down years ago. But she hesitated, then glanced at Nick. If she was placed in an orphanage and I was adopted separately, maybe that's why I never knew she existed. Nick's heart pounded. We have to go there. James didn't look convinced. It's probably abandoned by now. Maybe, Sarah agreed. But it's the only lead we have. The decision was made. By evening, they were packed into the car, driving toward the outskirts of town. The roads grew quieter, the houses fewer, until they were surrounded by trees on either side. Nick felt his pulse quicken as the car turned onto a narrow gravel road, leading up to a gated property. The sign was faded, barely legible, but the words sent a chill through him. Willowbrook Children's Home. James parked, and for a moment, nobody moved. The building ahead of them was large and gray, its windows broken, vines creeping up the stone walls. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But something about it felt important. Nick's hands tightened around the pendant in his lap. Maggie let out a low whine from the back seat. Sarah turned to him. Are you sure you want to do this? He nodded without hesitation. Yes. They stepped out of the car, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound. The air felt thick, heavy with something unspoken. Maggie stayed close to Nick's side as they approached the entrance. The massive wooden doors slightly ajar, as if someone had left them open just for them. James pushed the door wider, revealing a dark hallway lined with peeling wallpaper and dust-covered floors. The scent of old wood and time filled Nick's lungs as they stepped inside. Sarah ran her fingers along the wall, glancing at the remnants of an old directory. If Lillian lived here, there has to be something left behind. Records, photos, something. They began searching, moving carefully through the abandoned halls. Most of the rooms were empty, the furniture long gone, the walls bare except for faded murals of stars and moons. Then, in what must have once been an office, Sarah found a filing cabinet that had been left behind. Rusted but intact, her fingers trembled as she pulled open the drawer, flipping through old, yellowed papers. Then she stopped. Oh my God! Nick wheeled himself closer. What? What is it? Sarah slowly pulled out a file. The name on the tab read Lillian Bennett, but it wasn't just the name that made her breath catch. It was the date on the last entry. She was here, Sarah whispered, but she didn't disappear. She left. James frowned. Left? Where? Sarah swallowed hard, flipping to the final page. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She was transferred. Nick's stomach twisted. Transferred where? Sarah turned the paper round, pointing to the handwritten note at the bottom. One simple word. Rosewood. The room felt colder. Nick didn't know where Rosewood was, but he knew one thing for certain. They were closer, and something told him Maggie had known all along. The name Rosewood lingered in the air, pressing down on Nick like an invisible weight. He traced the letters with his eyes, committing them to memory, his fingers tightening around the pendant in his lap. His heart pounded, a mixture of nerves and anticipation. This was it. This was the first real clue to where Lillian had gone. Sarah held the file in her trembling hands, flipping through the last few pages as if they might hold more answers. James leaned in over her shoulder, his expression grim. There's no address, no details about what kind of place Rosewood is. His voice was low, cautious, and Nick could hear the uncertainty laced in his words. Sarah shook her head. But it's something. We know she was transferred. That means someone moved her, someone documented it. She exhaled sharply, pressing a hand to her forehead. We just need to figure out where. Nick turned his attention to Maggie, who sat beside him, her golden fur almost glowing in the dim light filtering through the dust-covered windows. Her ears were perked, her brown eyes alert, like she was waiting. She had led them here. She had led them to the wooden box. And now, she sat watching them expectantly, as if she already knew what came next. A shiver crawled down Nick's spine. We find Rosewood, he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. We find out what happened to her. James ran a hand through his hair, sighing. That might not be easy. If this place closed years ago, there might not be any records left. But even as he said it, Sarah was already pulling out her phone, fingers flying over the screen as she searched. Her brows furrowed as she scanned the results. Then suddenly, she stiffened. There's a Rosewood Institute about 50 miles from here, she murmured. It used to be a psychiatric hospital, but it was shut down 20 years ago. Nick's stomach twisted. A hospital. The word left a bitter taste in his mouth. Sarah nodded slowly. It says here it specialized in children's care. Orphaned kids, abandoned kids, kids they thought needed help. Her voice faltered slightly, and she swallowed hard before continuing. If Lillian was transferred there, it could mean a lot of things. James frowned. Or it could mean nothing. Maybe it was just a temporary placement, and she left before it shut down. But what if she didn't? Nick's voice was sharper than he intended, and both his parents turned to look at him. He felt heat rise to his face, but he pushed forward. What if she was stuck there? What if she never left? His grip on the pendant tightened. The thought made his chest ache, a cold fear settling deep in his bones. Silence filled the room. Maggie let out a low whine, shifting her weight closer to Nick, as if sensing the sudden heaviness in the air. Sarah inhaled deeply, straightening her back. There's only one way to find out. They didn't waste time. Within the hour, they were back on the road, the old file tucked safely in Sarah's bag. The drive was long, stretching through miles of open countryside and winding roads. The further they went, the more the landscape changed. Rolling hills turned into dense clusters of trees, and soon, the road narrowed into something that felt forgotten by time. Maggie lay curled up in the back seat, resting her head on Nick's lap, her rhythmic breathing the only sound breaking the tense silence. Finally, they saw it. The Rosewood Institute stood at the top of a hill, its massive structure looming against the darkening sky. The building was old, its stone walls cracked and worn. Vines creeping up its sides like nature was slowly reclaiming it. The windows were dark, empty, some shattered, others boarded up. A rusted sign at the front gate read nitrogen monoxide trespassing, the letters barely legible beneath years of neglect. James parked just outside the gate, turning off the engine. Nobody spoke for a moment. Nick stared up at the building, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He didn't know what he had expected, but it wasn't this. It looks abandoned, James murmured, gripping the steering wheel. Sarah nodded. But places like this always keep records. There might be something left behind. Nick swallowed, a strange unease crawling over him. Then we should go inside. James sighed. We shouldn't be breaking into. But before he could finish, Maggie suddenly leapt from the back seat, pushing the door open with her nose before trotting toward the gate. She barked once, ears alert, tail stiff. Nick's breath caught. She wants us to follow. James muttered something under his breath but opened his door, stepping out. Sarah followed, her expression wary. Nick hesitated only for a moment before gripping the wheels of his chair and maneuvering himself onto the uneven ground. The path to the entrance was cracked, weeds pushing through the cement. The metal gates left slightly ajar as if someone had forgotten to close them years ago. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and old stone. Every step felt like they were walking deeper into something they couldn't turn back from. The main entrance loomed before them, the large wooden doors weathered but still intact. James tested the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing a vast, empty lobby. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the slivers of fading sunlight that managed to seep through the cracks. In the boarded windows, the reception desk stood abandoned, its surface covered in papers left to rot. Wheelchairs sat unused in the corners, their rusted frames silent. Sarah moved forward cautiously, stepping over broken tiles and scattered debris. We need to find patient records. If Lillian was here, there has to be something left behind. Maggie trotted ahead, her nose low to the ground, sniffing. Nick followed her with his eyes, watching as she suddenly veered toward a hallway on the left. She barked once, then disappeared into the darkness. Nick's stomach twisted. She found something. James grabbed a flashlight from his pocket, clicking it on before stepping into the hallway after her. Sarah and Nick followed closely behind. The hallway was long, lined with peeling wallpaper and doorways leading into empty rooms. The air was colder here, the silence pressing against their ears like a held breath. Then Maggie stopped in front of a door, her body rigid, ears perked. Sarah stepped forward, pressing a trembling hand against the door. It had a small metal plaque, rusted with age, but the name was still visible. Lillian Bennett. Nick felt his throat tighten. He barely registered Sarah pushing the door open, barely heard James mutter something under his breath. He only saw the room beyond a small, sterile space, a metal bed frame still bolted to the floor, a single wooden desk pushed against the far wall, and on that desk, covered in dust and forgotten by time, lay an old, leather-bound journal. Sarah moved first, stepping into the room and picking up the journal with careful hands. She wiped away the dust, flipping open the first page. The handwriting was delicate, looping cursive that had faded over the years, and at the top of the page, written in ink that had long since bled into the paper, was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, it means you found me." The air in the room turned heavy. Nick felt his pulse hammer in his ears as Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide with something between fear and hope. They had found her, but what had they truly uncovered? Sarah's hands trembled as she held the journal, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her fingers brushed over the delicate, time-worn pages. Nick could hear the pounding of his own heart in the silence, each beat a reminder that they had finally reached the moment they had been chasing. The truth, or at least a piece of it, was within their grasp. James shifted beside her, his jaw tight as he scanned the room, the weight of the forgotten space settling over them. Dust clung to every surface, cobwebs stretched across the corners, and the stale scent of abandonment lingered in the air. But none of that mattered. Not now. Not when Lillian's words were waiting to be read. Sarah swallowed hard, inhaling through her nose before finally turning the first page. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible, scrawled in hurried, emotional strokes. "If you are reading this, it means you found me. Or at least, you've found what's left of me." Nick felt something coil tight in his chest. Maggie sat beside him, ears perked, watching Sarah as if she, too, understood the gravity of this moment. Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Lillian Bennett. I was brought to Rosewood when I was 6 years old. I don't remember much before that, only flashes of a home that felt warm, of a mother who smelled like vanilla, and of a sister. I think I had a sister, but I was told I was alone, that no one was coming for me, that this place was my home now." Sarah sucked in a sharp breath, pressing a hand against her chest as if to steady herself. "Oh my God," she murmured. James rubbed his face, exhaling through his nose. "Keep reading." Sarah nodded, her eyes flicking across the next lines. "I used to believe them. I used to believe that I had been abandoned, that I was unwanted. But when I turned 10, I found something. A pendant. It was old, gold, and had an inscription inside. Forever intertwined Lillian Viscera. That's when I knew. I wasn't alone. I had a sister, and someone had kept that from me. Nick's throat tightened as he glanced down at the pendant in his lap, the same inscription staring back at him. It was real. Everything was real. Sarah turned the page, her voice shaking now. I tried to ask questions. I begged for answers, but the doctors told me I was confused, that I was making things up. They told me I was sick. They said I was imagining things, that my mind was fragile, and that if I didn't stop, I would be punished. A cold chill ran through Nick's veins. He could see Sarah's hands gripping the journal tighter, her knuckles turning white. James' expression darkened, his shoulders tense as he shifted uncomfortably. Sarah continued, "But I wasn't wrong. I knew I wasn't wrong. So I started looking for proof, searching through records, hiding in offices to listen. And that's when I learned the truth. I wasn't sick. I wasn't abandoned. I was stolen, taken, separated from my sister because someone decided I didn't belong anywhere else but here." Nick's stomach churned, his fingers digging into the fabric of his jeans. Maggie whined softly beside him, pressing her nose into his hand, grounding him as the weight of the revelation settled. I knew I had to get out. I knew I had to find my sister. So I ran. I planned for months, memorized the halls, waited for the right moment, and when the storm came, when the power went out, I ran. I don't know if anyone chased me. I don't remember how far I got, but I remember waking up in a small town, half frozen, being taken in by a kind man named Thomas. He gave me shelter. He gave me safety. And for the first time, I had a home. But even then, I was afraid. Afraid they would find me. Afraid they would take me back. So I never stopped hiding. Sarah's voice cracked, and she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Nick's mind reeled, trying to process it all. Lillian had escaped. She had lived. She had been out there this entire time. But then why had she never come looking? Why had she never found Sarah? Sarah turned to the final page, her breath hitching. I don't know if I'll ever find her. I don't know if she even knows I exist. But I hope she does. I hope that one day she finds this. And if she does, I want her to know I never forgot. I want her to know I loved her, even if I never got to say it. And I want her to know that if she ever finds my son, he was always meant to know the truth. He was always meant to find his way home. The room was silent. Sarah let out a small sob, pressing the journal to her chest as if she could pull Lillian closer through the pages. James sat down heavily on the edge of the old bed frame, running a hand through his hair. Nick stared at the words, at the final, desperate plea his mother had left behind. Her son. She had meant him. Maggie nudged him again, and for the first time, he understood. She hadn't just been guiding them. She had been fulfilling Lillian's last wish. She had been leading him home. Tears burned at the edges of his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. Instead, he took a deep breath, gripping the pendant in his palm. "She wanted me to find this," he said, his voice hoarse. "She wanted me to know." Sarah nodded, still clutching the journal like a lifeline. "She never forgot you, Nick. She never forgot me. She fought for us." James exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. "The question is, what happened after this? If she escaped, if she lived, where did she go?" Nick glanced at Maggie, who was now sitting calmly beside them, her mission complete. And somehow, deep in his bones, he knew the answer. "She's gone," he whispered. "She never made it back." A heavy stillness settled in the room. The truth was both painful and freeing. Lillian had fought, she had run, and she had survived long enough to leave behind a message, a hope. And even if she was gone, even if Nick would never get to meet her, he had found what she wanted him to find. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "We bring this home," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "We honor her. We remember her." Nick nodded, looking down at the pendant one last time before slipping it over his head. It rested against his chest, warm and solid, a piece of history he would carry forever. As they left the room, stepping back into the fading light of evening, Nick glanced back one last time. The air felt lighter now, as if something had been released, as if the past had finally been allowed to rest. And as they stepped outside, Maggie trotting beside them, tail wagging gently, Nick knew one thing for certain. He wasn't lost anymore. He had found his way home.